Today, we're finishing up the series called Right in the Eye. Right in the Eye. It's been an unusual Christmas series. Some of you are wondering where are Mary and Joseph and the little drummer boy, who, by the way, isn't actually part of the Christmas story, the little drummer boy, that is. And instead, we've replaced them with things like a concubine who's cut up and shipped off like a vaccine across all 50 states by UPS to the different, tribes of Israel. We talked about Samson, whose eyes were gouged out, and then he was crushed by a temple collapsing. And we've just opted for a different Christmas story this year, but I promise it's all going to come together. It's all going to make sense today. And I think, hopefully in this series you've realized that there are some similarities to the world 3,300 years ago as there are to today, because we've been going through this book in the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures called the Old Testament. It's the book of Judges, and it was an interesting period of time in Israel's history. In fact, Israel had a lot in common with us. It was a time when Israel was a theocracy. We're not a theocracy, but Israel was. And the idea of a theocracy is that God is king. God is king. There's no human king. God is king. And there were these judges, 12 men and women, who were raised up to help lead Israel during this time. But, as is true for many of us, Israel didn't like God being king. Israel didn't like the rules. They didn't like the restrictions. They chose something that so many of us choose, and that is autonomy. Autonomy. We Americans, we can relate to that. We believe that we have the right to do what we want, when we want, with whom we want, and nobody's going to tell us what to do. Nobody's going to tell us how we should parent, how we should, handle our relationships, what our morality should look like. Nobody's going to give us instructions about our future. We're going to do what we want, when we want, with whom we want. But because that sounds a little autonomous, we talked about the little caveat we Americans throw on there. Remember what it is? As long as what? As long as it doesn't hurt anybody or nobody gets hurt. As long as it doesn't hurt anybody. But the lie that we've been talking about for the last 5 weeks is it always hurts somebody. Autonomy is a lie. The idea that I can do what I want, when I want, with whom I want, and nobody's going to be hurt in the process, it's just not true. Because it hurts us. We hurt ourselves when we choose to be autonomous. When we think we are setting ourselves free, we are actually building a prison around ourselves. The book of Judges, it ends with this kind of haunting statement. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And the nation of Israel that was set up to do extraordinary things and to be an extraordinary nation instead chose to do what was right in their own eyes. They settled for the ordinary. They looked around them. They looked at the morality that the other countries around them were adopting. They adopted the gods that other countries were worshiping. And in the process, they missed what God had for them. They abandoned what God had for them. They went through this ongoing cycle we've been talking about, in case you haven't been with us. They went like this, that they would disobey because they didn't really like God's rules. They didn't like his laws. And whenever they disobeyed, whenever they chose autonomy, it led to disaster, as it does for all of us. And then they would cry out to God for help, and he would send one of these 12 judges to deliver them, and he would lead them to a place of freedom. Now, just by show of hands, and this is an all skate for all of us in the room, how many of us can relate to this cycle that we've been talking about? Look around. It's pretty much all of us. It should be all of us. Those of you who aren't raising your hands, you're liars. And, you're in church, so just so you know. I mean, it's just so true because whether it was God or some other authority in our lives, there was some law, there was some rule, there was something we didn't want to obey, and we wanted to do our own thing, and so we did our own thing. And it ended up in disaster. And when we realized it, and when we finally came to our senses, we cried out to the person or to the God or whoever it was that we needed help from. And you called your mom or dad or whoever it was, and they helped you out. They stepped in, and they delivered you. We can all relate to that. And that was Israel for 300 years. It was Israel for 300 years. So I just summarized all of that in about 3 minutes. It was bleak. In fact, we were having a conversation, among the staff, and as I've left these messages each week, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it is so heavy. It's so heavy, and maybe you've felt that. And that's intentional because that's what the nation of Israel was going through. It was heavy. It was bleak. Not altogether unlike the year 2020, where things have been heavy for us. Things have seemed bleak. But the thing I want to try and convince you of today, it's my goal in our time together, is that in the middle of the bleak, in the middle of the heavy, in the middle of the disaster that was the nation of Israel, God was up to something. In the middle of the hopelessness, God was planting a seed of hope, and God was decorating for the first Christmas. Now, I'll give you a warning up front before we get into all this. I have a really hard time retelling the story we're going to tell today without getting emotional. And the reason is because when you just pause, and when you think about all that we've been through in the last year, maybe all that you've been through in your entire life, when you pause and you think about all we've been talking about at the nation of Israel for this horrible time period that they were living in, God was still at work. God was still on the move. God was still doing something, and he was bringing hope to a group of people who were so very hopeless. And so I want you to know that today. There is a glimmer of hope, and I'm going to convince you today that God was ultimately at work. Now, last week we talked about a man named Gideon. Likely you've heard of Gideon before. He was a judge who did a pretty good job as a judge. He didn't have a ton of faith. In fact, he kind of believed that God had worked in the past, but God maybe wasn't working anymore. Some of you can relate to that. In fact, if you're here today and you just feel like, you've heard the story of God from generations in the past, you've heard of the God of old. Maybe your parents attended revivals, or maybe they went to the big tents, or did the altar call, or got the quiver in the liver, and they were talking about how emotional it was, and they went forward to Billy Graham, or whatever it was. I mean, you just hear those stories, and you realize that faith was real for them, but you may not have stories of your own. You may feel like this, that if God was so real, why haven't I experienced him in my life? I've heard the stories of the past. I mean, this is the nation of Israel. I've heard the stories of Abraham. I've heard the stories of, the promise that God's going to make him a great nation. He's going to bless all the world through him. I've heard the stories of Moses leading the Israelites to freedom through the promised land. I mean, I've heard all of that. I know that, but I haven't experienced him in my own life. I'm not sure he isn't just a myth. I'm not sure that he's actually God. Now, for others of you in the room, maybe you've had a bit of a different experience, or watching online. I don't want to exclude you. Maybe you've had a different experience where you think, God was very real to me in the past, but I haven't felt God's presence in the present. And you may be thinking to yourself, why has God abandoned me? To be quite honest, I think many people in the world right now are asking that question. Many people in our country are asking that question. Why has God abandoned me? If God is so real, why is he allowing this virus? Why is he allowing the pandemic? Why is he allowing the hurt, the pain? Why is he allowing cancer? Why is he allowing, sickness and death and breakups and relational strife? I mean, why does God, if he's so good, where is he? Why has he abandoned me? That's what the nation of Israel was going through. And it was right there in the midst of the chaos of the judges that God took a man and a woman who lived differently, who lived such extraordinary, God-honoring lives, and he used them to set the stage for the world-changing event that we celebrate this Friday. He was decorating for Christmas when everyone else thought he was gone, he was never there, or he was asleep. And so we're going to talk about that family today. When people wondered, is God still there? He proved he was still there. And we're going to talk about a story that took place during this time period of the Judges, but it doesn't take place in the book of Judges. It actually is a book called Ruth. If you've heard of Ruth before, you may not know that Ruth took place during this time period. The thing you should know about Ruth is you should read it on your own. We're not going to have time to go through the entire story today, but it is such a rich story. It's 4 chapters. It'll take you about 10 minutes to read sometime today or later this week. I hope you'll spend some time reading through it because it is just such an incredible story. I'm going to do my best to tell parts of it and read parts of it. It's such an inspiration. But here we go. Ruth chapter 1. Verse 1, the text says, in the days when the judges ruled, again, that's that period between when Joshua died, when David became king, about a 330-year time period. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem, It's where Jesus is going to be born, 1,300 years after this. A man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, to give you an idea where the country of Moab is, we've got a map here we can take a look at. So Jerusalem's way up here. Moab is kind of southeast of that. And so in order to get to Moab, they would have to travel across the Red Sea, either going north and then south, or coming down here and going across. So it wasn't a short journey. It wasn't a small thing. Verse 2, the text continues, and it says, the man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were difficult to pronounce, and I'll let you figure them out on your own. So Elimelech, he takes his family, because there's a famine in the land. Things are not going the way that he wanted. He heard about greener pastures somewhere else, and so they uproot their family, and they move across the Dead Sea down to this country of Moab, which frankly is not altogether unlike some of us. When things don't go the way we want, when things maybe seem a little bit hopeless, we look somewhere else. We look for a greener pasture. And so that's what they did, forgetting or failing to see what God may have been doing right there in the moment, in the midst of it. So they travel down to Moab, and while they're down there, they marry off their 2 sons. They marry them off to Moabite women because they're living outside of the nation of Israel. They did the very thing God had instructed them not to do, as we've been talking about. And the reason they weren't to marry people from other countries was because God didn't want them worshiping other gods. And so as they married all these other people, the other gods would be brought into their families, and God didn't want that for them. But they disobeyed. They did their own thing. They did what was right in their own eyes. And then Elimelech dies. And then one of their sons dies. And then another son dies. And then Naomi finds herself in a foreign land among foreign people with 2 foreign daughters-in-law and no reason to be there. And surely in those moments, she must have felt like the nation felt, perhaps like you felt. God has forgotten me. God has abandoned me. God has neglected me. He has not cared for me. He has not done for me the thing that he should have done. And so Naomi made the decision that she was going to travel back home. She heard the famine was over in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, so that she decides she's going to go back home. And as she's going back home, she decides to set her daughters-in-law free. Now, we've talked during this time period, or in this series, we've talked that during this time period, it was a dangerous place for women. It was dangerous for a number of accounts, but essentially, if Naomi dies, and when Naomi dies, her daughters-in-law would have no one. They wouldn't have a male to take care of them. They needed a man to take care of them back in this time period. She wasn't going to have any more children. She was beyond the childbearing ages. And so she decides to tell her daughters-in-law, one's name was Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah, and she decides to tell her daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, that they should go back to their families. They should stay in their homeland. They should find a young man to marry and have children and somebody to take care of them. They do not need to accompany her. So Orpah, she decides to go home, but Ruth did something that was so unheard of, so unthinkable, so frankly kind. She said, I want to stay with you. Naomi argued with her and said, no, you need to go home. There's nothing here for you. It was going to be a dangerous journey back. Again, it was kind of a hopeless future. But here's what Ruth said. Ruth replied to her. She said, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. In other words, I'm going to not do what's right in my own eyes. I'm going to do what's right in your God's eyes. He's becoming my God. She said, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. She said, Naomi, I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm going to do the kind thing. I am going to stay with you. So they travel back to Bethlehem. Miraculously, they make it safely. And as they arrive back in town, you know how it is in a small town. We all live in small town. I mean, people start talking. And they start seeing her. They're like, isn't that Naomi? I think that's Naomi. Didn't she move away with her husband and sons? Where are they? And who's this strange woman who's come back with her? And so they start questioning. And one day, somebody has the courage to go talk to her personally. And when they talk to her personally, Naomi says, don't even call me Naomi anymore. Just call me Mara, which means bitter, because I'm just bitter about life. Here's what she said, verse 21. She said, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. I mean, think about the words she speaks here. She said, why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. This is God's fault. Woe is me. I mean, joy and life has just been sucked out of me. There is nothing left of joy in this life. Now imagine what a little ray of sunshine she was to be around. Imagine signing yourself up for an endless future with this woman whose glass was proverbially half empty. And that was the case. That was the situation. And yet here's what's remarkable. She had no idea that 3,300 years later, the group of people here in Batesville, Indiana, would be talking about her. She had no idea that she was part of the story of God. She had no idea what God was doing behind the scenes. And frankly, it didn't have a lot to do with her. It had a lot to do with her daughter-in-law, who showed an unbelievable kindness to her by being willing to stick with her in spite of the circumstances. Now, there were some fortuitous things that were taking place here. As Ruth and Naomi moved back into Bethlehem, it was during the barley harvest. And the nation of Israel had built-in laws to help care for poor people. And so one of those was the Law of Gleaning. And essentially, as people would harvest their fields, what would happen is that the poor and the destitute, the widows, they could actually go into this field and they could pick up the scraps that the harvesters had left behind. They were instructed they were only allowed to harvest one time over their fields, and because they didn't have modern machinery, there was a lot left over. So that was not a free handout. It was a way for those who needed help to work hard and to provide for themselves. And so they came back in the middle of this season, and so Ruth made the decision that she was going to go out and glean in the field. And it just so happened that she chose a field of a man. She had no idea who he was, but his name was Boaz. And it turns out that Boaz was a distant relative of her dead father-in-law, Elimelech. And so she ends up on this field. The fields were not always safe places for women, quite honestly, because you've got male harvesters who at times would take advantage of the women. Imagine Ruth being a foreign woman and the higher likelihood of being taken advantage of. But Boaz, he came back, he saw the head of his harvesters, and he saw this woman he didn't recognize, and he asked the head of his harvesters, well, who is this woman? He said, well, you've heard the story of Naomi. You know that she came back. This is Ruth. And immediately Boaz was impressed. He had heard about the character of Ruth, and so he went to his harvesters. He said, look, you are not to lay a hand on her. You are not to do anything to harm her. In fact, I want you to leave out extra sheaves of barley and wheat for her. I want you to do everything you can to help her. And when Ruth found out about this, she was perplexed. Why was Boaz showing her this incredible kindness? And so here's what Boaz said to her. He replied, he said, I've been told about what you have done. Ruth, word is getting out about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard about it. How you left your father, continuing on, how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. I mean, everyone else is doing what's right in their own eyes, but Ruth, you did what was right in God's eyes. He goes on, he says, may the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. What he says is, Ruth, when you submit yourself under the Lord, God takes care of you. The same God that Naomi, her mother-in-law, believed had abandoned her and had neglected her and afflicted her, Boaz says, when you place yourself under that God's care, he looks out for you. He cares for you. And I'm going to be a part of seeing that through. And so, as I said, Boaz told his servants to not hurt Ruth, to protect her, to watch over her. And she went home that night, and she talked to Naomi, and Naomi, she brought in what she had harvested. It was far more than Naomi expected. Naomi said, where did you go today? And Ruth said, well, there's a man named Boaz. I was in his field. And a little light bulb went on for Naomi as she began reflecting and say, hey, he's actually a distant relative of ours. That's interesting. And over 7 weeks' time, because the wheat harvest came after the barley harvest, over a 7-week time period, Ruth went every day. She worked hard. She harvested. And miraculously, she brought home enough food to feed her and Naomi for nearly a year. Now, when you and I hear that, it's like, oh, that's cool. When the readers originally heard that, they would have been blown away because they would have recognized and said, that's not luck. I mean, that's not chance. That didn't just randomly happen. That is the hand of God. That is God's generous provision looking out for her. And so at the end of this time period, Naomi kind of comes to this conclusion. She says, you know what? Ruth, I want to ask you something. I want you to go to Boaz, and I want you to ask him to be our kinsman redeemer. Our kinsman redeemer. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing, and let me explain a little bit. A kinsman is a male relative during this time period, and a redeemer is, you know what it means to redeem something. You pay and you redeem something, or you give a ticket or whatever, and you redeem something. So during this time period, a kinsman redeemer would be a close male relative, not altogether different from a rich uncle that you call on when you need some help, right? I'm sure you all have a rich uncle that you can call. When you're in a destitute situation, I mean, that's what a kinsman redeemer was. You would go to this relative and you would ask them for help. This was, again, another law that God had established to set Israel apart. It protected one person from being too powerful among the nation. It protected one tribe from taking over the other tribes because things could always be redeemed. They could be returned to the rightful original owners. It kept balance. And so here's how it would happen. There were a couple ways that a kinsman redeemer would redeem the family. The first one was they would protect an impoverished family. So if there was some debt they were owed, they would call on their kinsman redeemer, ask to help pay the debt. Sometimes there was property they would repurchase. They would repurchase lost property. And they would go to kinsman redeemer and say, well, it was collected because we didn't have the money to pay for it. And so, will you help us with that? They would redeem relatives who were sold as slaves. Sometimes they would have to sell family members off because they didn't have funds. And then the last one was they would provide an heir for male relatives. Now, here's what's interesting. Sometimes what a kinsman redeemer would do is marry a widow, and in marrying the widow, they wouldn't take on the kinsman redeemer's name. It would continue the name of the deceased male. And so in this case, Naomi was asking Ruth to basically go to Boaz and say, will you marry me? Now, think about that in our culture, and then go back 3,300 years. I mean, that's kind of a big ask, right? It's like, hey, I'm available. You want to marry me? Will you step in? Will you be our kinsman redeemer? Now, see, here's the thing. He couldn't really be the kinsman redeemer for Naomi because Naomi was too old. She couldn't have an heir. There wouldn't be a baby that would come through Naomi. But essentially, she asked Boaz to be my kinsman redeemer. Now, again, it's a big ask. And it's a big ask for a number of reasons. One is that when they would marry, that person that they would marry would become part of the inheritance. And so there would be a split inheritance. And so a piece of this property, particularly now Ruth is a foreigner. So a piece of Boaz's estate would be given to Ruth. Imagine you're one of Boaz's children, natural children, normal children from original wife. And you hear that he's going to marry some foreigner and who knows who's going to come knocking at his door saying, I'm some distant, blah, blah, can you help us out? I mean, it was a big ask. And yet Ruth made the decision that she would ask him. And she went to him, and she, at a time where he was most vulnerable. Now, if you read the story on your own later, a lot of times people like to read some sexual innuendo in there. It's not there, let me just tell you. These were two upstanding, extraordinary people with extraordinary character. Ruth chose a time where he would be most receptive because there was a lot at risk. He had cared for her. He had watched out for her. This could end it all. Right? I mean, her future was at risk. His future was at risk. What would he say? So she went to him and he said, I'm willing to do it because I have seen your character, which, ladies, is just a good lesson for you because the right guy will notice your character every single time. And so he says, yes, I'm willing to do it, but there's a hitch. There's actually a relative who is closer in relationship, and he has the first right. So the next day, Boaz went out to the city gate, which is where kind of the official business of the town would take place. And he saw this relative walking by. He grabbed him. He had a conversation with him. He's like, look, I've been asked to be the kinsman redeemer, but you actually have the first right to that. And so are you interested? And the man said, yeah, I am interested. I want to buy that property. I want the property. Now, because this was a time period where people did what was right in their own eyes, the right thing would have been to marry Ruth and buy back the property. But this man had no intention of marrying Ruth. So Boaz kind of put a little pressure on him. Here's what Boaz said when he talked to him. He said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite. See, they did this in the public so that everyone would hear, and they would hear his character. He said, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. It's that whole split inheritance thing. But most people, again, they ignored that rule. They did what was right in their own eyes. But again, he called them to the carpet on it. So it says this, at this, the guardian redeemer, which is another way of saying kinsman redeemer, said, well, then I can't redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. He says, I don't want to risk my name. I don't want to risk my heritage. Do you know what his name is? I don't either. It's not recorded. In fact, in the Hebrew, it's recorded as so-and-so, essentially the equivalent of so-and-so. He said, I'm not going to do what's right for them. I'm going to do what's right in my own eyes. And so Boaz, this extraordinary man, made a God-honoring decision with this woman who was an extraordinary woman who lived a God-honoring life. And he said, then I will marry her. And they exchanged sandals between him and the other kinsman redeemer, because that's what you did to make it official. Immediately, Ruth became pregnant after they got married. And she gave birth to a boy whose name was Obed, which means servant of God. And Naomi, right? I mean, remember Naomi, the mother-in-law who thought God had abandoned her and God had left her. She suddenly realized that God was actually at work behind the scenes, that God was working through somebody who was even outside of the covenant people of Israel, through this Moabite woman, Ruth, this daughter-in-law. In fact, people came up to Naomi and said, your daughter-in-law is better than 7 sons. I mean, that's how remarkable she was. And Naomi realized what a blessing Ruth had been in her life. But the story gets so much better. It gets so much richer. Because Naomi dies, and Ruth dies, and Boaz dies. But Obed, he has a son. You know his son's name? His son's name was Jesse. And Jesse had 8 sons. And at the time he had 8 sons, the nation of Israel finally had a king, and the king's name was Saul, but Saul wasn't a very good king. And so God spoke to the prophet Samuel and said, Samuel, I want you to go to Bethlehem because there is a man who has 8 sons. I want you to go to Jesse's house. In fact, here's what the text says in 1 Samuel. He says, the Lord said to Samuel, fill your horn with oil, be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. And so he shows up at Jesse's house and he says, I'm going to anoint one of your sons to be king. Who wouldn't be excited about that, right? I get to be the dad of a king. And so he lines the boys up and goes down son by son by son by son. None of those is the right son. And so Samuel looks at Jesse and says, is there anybody else? Jesse says, well, I've got one boy. He's out in the fields, tending sheep, but let's be honest, he's not really king material. And Samuel says, well, I want you to send for him. So he brings him in. And in that moment, David is anointed to be the king of the nation of Israel because he was a man after God's own heart. And as David led the nation of Israel, he brought restoration. He brought the tribes together. In the midst of the mess that was the period of Judges, David brought wholeness and healing and restoration, and he brought them back to a place of worshiping God. And because of that, the prophet Nathan, years later, would go to David and say this, speaking on God's behalf, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. And it was established in these moments that the nation of Israel knew that if there were going to be a Messiah, he would come from the house of David. David, who was the son of Jesse, who was the son of Obed, who was the son of Boaz, who had married Ruth, the Moabite woman. And then David had a son, who had a son, who had a son, who had a son. And about 25 begots later, in the book of Matthew, chapter 1, we read this. Eliezer, the father of Madden, Madden, the father of Jacob, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who's called the Messiah, who was born on Christmas Day. They had no idea. And Jesus would be referred to as the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of David. Born in the town of Bethlehem, where Naomi, unbeknownst to herself, brought her Moabite daughter-in-law who would marry Boaz, who would have a son, all the way down to Jesus. And here's the thing, they had no idea. They had no idea that 1,300 years later, their distant relative and his pregnant fiancée would travel to Bethlehem, and there she would give birth to the King of Kings. They had no idea what God was doing in the background. They had no idea that wise men would travel from the east, not to just see a baby, but to see the baby. That King Herod would be so threatened by the idea of a king being born that he would seek out little baby boys throughout the region and kill them because he did not want anyone to threaten his power. They had no idea that this king was coming who would lay down his life and that he would tell other people to love others the way he loved them. That he wouldn't leverage his authority for power, he would leverage his authority for the good of other people. They had no idea that the Roman government would put Jesus to death. They had no idea that he would be standing in front of Pontius Pilate, governor of the land, who had been appointed by Roman Emperor Tiberius. And that Pilate would look Jesus in the eye and say, "Are you a king?" And Jesus would say, "Yeah, but not in the way you think." Jesus would say, "This kingdom, my kingdom, is not of this world. I'm a different sort of king." And what's so interesting is Pontius Pilate and Emperor Tiberius and many others would simply become footnotes in the King of Kings, King Jesus, who came, not to leverage his power and authority over other people, but to leverage his power and authority for other people. And he invited his followers to love one another the way he loved them through an incredible selflessness, an incredible love. And he left no doubt about whether or not he was for people. He demonstrated that he was for people. By giving his life away, he didn't demand allegiance. He invited people to follow him, and he offered a gift of life to all who were willing to receive it. And they had no idea. They had no idea. And my friends, that gift of life is available for you too, regardless of where you're from, regardless of what your background is, or how bad you've been, or how much you've doubted or questioned God. That gift of life is free, and that is available for you this Christmas. Jesus is willing to redeem you the way that Boaz redeemed Ruth in such a beautiful way. He wants to be the Lord of your life. But he doesn't force his way in. He doesn't push his way in. He simply gives an invitation. And so what took hundreds of years of God's planning behind the scenes could make this your best Christmas ever. A simple decision. A simple decision that says, I'm tired of doing what's right in my own eyes. Because doing what's right in my own eyes never leads me the place where I think it's going to lead me. Doing what's right in my own eyes builds a prison around me. It doesn't lead to freedom. Autonomy does not give freedom. Autonomy robs us of freedom. And so the invitation for you this season, this Christmas, when I think about the year that we have had, the questions so many of us have asked, the wonderings of where is God in the midst of all this? It's an opportunity for us to respond. Wherever you are. And say, I don't want to do what's right in my own eyes. I'm choosing Jesus to be my King. And so in just a minute, I want to invite you to pray along with me. There's nothing magic about the words. It's really just a turning of your heart. It's really just an inviting him in and saying, I'm surrendering myself to you as king, and I'm choosing to trust you as king. If you've never done that before, again, I mean, this could be the most amazing Christmas season ever for you. And I want to invite you to respond in just a second when we pray. Or it could be that you've kind of wandered away from God. It's the God of your past, but he's not been the God of your present. And you've just been doing what's right in your own eyes. And if that's true for you, I want to invite you to pray along as well. To say, God, I'm inviting you back to be the center of my life. So, out of respect for everyone in the room, would you just bow your head and would you close your eyes? And if you want to pray with me, I invite you to do so. You can pray out loud. You can pray in your heart, however you want to do it. And just say, Heavenly Father, I don't want to be king anymore. Doing what's right in my own eyes does not lead to freedom. And so I'm choosing to recognize you as my Savior, Jesus as my Lord. I'm choosing to trust him with my life. God, would you forgive me for what I have done in the past, how I have wandered away from you, and would you help me to walk with you in the future? And now let me just pray for all of us in the room. Father, what an amazing story. To know that you were at work at times when people wondered where you were and what you were doing, but you were piecing things together in such a beautiful way. So that 3,300 years later, here in Batesville, Indiana, someone could cry out to you and receive hope. That all of us in this room would have the privilege of knowing hope. You truly are an amazing God. And so we celebrate that this Christmas. Thank you for the beauty of this story. Let us reflect on it as we think about what we get to celebrate this Friday. I pray these things in Jesus' name.